Hello the world, hello internet, hello Jason Isaac. Let's do some judicial review. And we're starting with the police, not an aspect of the judiciary, but it is a great song and worth some time. Every breath you take, every move you make, every bond you break, every step you take, I'll be watching you every single day. Okay, thank you, Sting. We'll come back to that later. This is the second or third time I've tried this. Previously, the sound was profoundly compromised for some reason. I don't know why. And I also ran out of time. So this is the first of two parts of a presentation on the rule of law and, on judicial review. And I hope that it helps. Let's start by making something very, very clear right at the very start. Judicial review is not about whether justice is done. This is not about right and wrong. This is whether or not law has been properly applied. It's whether or not a law has been taken and applied properly. Now, that is a good definition for you to learn, and it's a good definition for you to learn for all sorts of reasons. Not least, it's not mine. This comes from the website, from the Courts and Tribunals Judiciary, subdivision of the courts themselves. And it's your definition there. It's a good type. Follow that particular link and learn it. Right, so this is not about whether something is right or wrong, whether a policy is right or wrong. It's whether or not the policy has been properly implemented or indeed the law has been followed appropriately. That's the first thing that I want to get across. And I think the second thing that I want to get across is that if Parliament is doing its job properly, then perhaps we wouldn't be in this particular mess, but we'll come to that in a little while. So how can policy be applied inappropriately? And the first of those is ultra vires. That is when you have acted beyond your power. In other words, Parliament has given you an inch, but you've taken it a mile. You've stretched the power that has been given to you to an unreasonable level. This is doing things that the law has not officially granted or sanctioned. This I like to think as being analogous to the rule of law. The law says this: if you don't do that, then if you do something else, then essentially you have exceeded the law. You've exceeded what was offered to you. It's not a direct corollary or correlation, but it works in effect, particularly when we look at this. When we look at this particular decision, if we say that a decision is either illegal, not authorized by law, or that it's irrational or unreasonable, predicated on a procedural impropriety, which is another way of saying that somebody didn't follow the rules, then we can say that arguably this has a closer relation with natural justice. So if this is about natural justice and this is about the rule of law says you can do one thing and you do something else, then you've acted ultra vires. If a decision is illegal, or if it's irrational or unreasonable, or it's someone didn't follow the rules, then essentially natural justice has been breached. So we can look at judicial review as a way of identifying if the rule of law has been breached or if natural justice has been breached. But that's just for you, okay? That's not really a formal way of recognizing it, but it may help you remember that there are two ways two particular types of judicial review you can look at. You can look at ultra vires, or you can look at whether or not a decision is illegal, irrational, unreasonable, predicated on a procedural impropriety. Two different ways of challenging something in the courts. And again, it comes back to the idea of why judicial review is important. You're looking at a decision, you're saying, is this decision right? Not is it morally right, but is has the decision been reached, or has this action been reached legitimately? Is it sanctioned by law? Is it rational? Is it reasonable? Not asking whether it's good or bad or right and wrong, just whether or not it is supported by law. So this is a technical exercise that we're looking at here. Now, why is judicial review important? Well, it's important for three reasons. The first of those is that our rights are described by laws. And if laws are not being followed, then your rights are not being upheld. There can't be many things more important than that. And that is absolutely critical. And the more rights are described by law, the more we see our rights being codified by law, then the more important judicial review becomes. The other reason why judicial review is important is that Parliament is rubbish. We know this. Parliament is neither independent nor neutral. Now, if Parliament were independent and neutral, then perhaps it would be a better arbiter of the government's exercise of its legislation, of the way in which the government is implementing its legislation. But it's not. Parliament is not a fit judge of whether or not the government is doing a good job, because it is neither independent nor is it neutral. And this is so important. This is so important. If Parliament could do its job properly, then we wouldn't have seen this massive increase in demand for judicial review. People are becoming less satisfied with the job that government is doing. They're also becoming less satisfied with the job that Parliament is doing, checking that government is doing a good job, and as a result of which they are seeking redress through the courts. And finally, legislation is very, very complicated. Somebody needs to act as a referee. Yeah, the huge flow of legislation seems to be showing no sign of slowing down. And as laws get piled on top of laws, then somebody needs to come in and make sense of the situation. Now, they're not going to turn around and tell Parliament that Parliament is wrong. They can't do that because Parliament is sovereign. But what they can do is try to find a way of reconciling all of these laws and finding out which laws fit inside other laws. And that's a kind of complicated way of explaining it, and I hope it's just about made sense. But really, that's one of the jobs the courts do, is to try to reconcile laws and to find a way of making them all compatible and nestling them one inside the other, rather like Russian dolls. So there are, however, problems with judicial review, and they largely stem from the government not being allowed to do what the government wants to do. And most of the time the government wants to do something that suits it, that makes its job easier. And when the courts turn around and say no, then the government tends to cry foul. And the first way they'll call foul is that this is an interference with policy sovereignty. And of course, if you've been following the Brexit debate, you'll know all about this. It is claimed that when the courts turn around and say to the government, you can't do that, then what they're doing is they are limiting the government's ability to devise policy and implement legislation. We deal with that in the next slide, but frankly, most of the time that's utter rubbish. The second claim is that the courts are limiting Parliament's ability to legislate, and that too is not strictly true. But let's explain exactly what I mean by that. Let's start with policy sovereignty. Now, let's assume that the government wants to do something and the courts turn around and tell them that they can't do that. Well, the reason they can't do that is because of the rule of law. If they can't do it, then that particular action is not sanctioned by law. So when Jeremy Hunt decided he was going to go in and close Lewisham Hospital, that was challenged in the courts, and the court said, no, actually, sorry, Jeremy, you can't do that, because the rule of law applies to everybody. Nobody is above the law. If the law says you can't shut down hospitals unilaterally, then not even the health secretary can shut down laws unilaterally. The health secretary, just like every other secretary, just like every other aspect of government, can only do what the law lets them do. And of course, the rule of law, you will remember, is the 4 Alls, not the 5 Alls, the rather magnificent pub that lives next door to me, 5 Alls, but rather the 4 Alls. And that is the general principle that all laws apply to all people at all times, and all in the same way. And government has to operate within the law. There are no excuses, it really has to. Most egregiously, I do recall that in the case of Al Yamamah, the arms deal, Lord Goldsmith, Labour's Attorney General, once had the nerve to say that sometimes the rule of law needs to be balanced against the wider needs of public safety, I think it was, or the wider public interest. And I have to say for myself, I can't see any incident in which the wider public interest is ever served by playing fast and loose with the rule of law. But I'm going off into the weeds. The other reason, of course, is natural justice. The government has to apply law consistently and fairly and competently. And again, that brings us back to that first slide. Now, has the law been applied consistently? Has the law been applied rationally? Well, if it hasn't, then the government has essentially broken the rules. And so we can see 2 ways here in which the government might be either guilty of ultra vires or of irrational application of law, but essentially the government is bound by the law, just like everybody else. And just quickly looking at Brexit, the Brexit referendum, that was described by law, but that was it. The Brexit referendum just asked the people the question, and there was no sort of afters after that. And so afterwards, the government wanted to trigger Article 50 to begin the extraction process. And under normal circumstances, because that's foreign policy, it would have been governed largely by the royal prerogative and there wouldn't be a problem. However, the UK's membership of the EU is described by legislation, specifically the 1972 European Communities Act. And if it's described by legislation, if we go in by legislation, then we have to come out by legislation. And of course, we know that only Parliament gets to mess with law. And so Parliament could authorise the government to trigger Article 50. It could pass the legislation to unwind the 1972 European Communities Act, but it hadn't done so yet. And so the government could not, the court said, the government could not unilaterally trigger Article 50 because that would effectively change British law. Now, this was judicial review. They said that the government's exercise of the government decision was not supported by law. It was not covered. It was inconsistent with the rule of law. And so, yeah, they couldn't do it. And that's why at the time of recording, Parliament is still mulling over the Brexit bill. It'll come out in due course, and I won't be that surprised. Anyway, this is what Lord Neuberger had to say about it. I'm not going to say anything. You just hit pause and you read that. And you should now be back in the room. Let's have a very quick look at legal sovereignty. Now, Parliament is the legal sovereign. So every time it creates a new law, there is that notion of implied repeal. That if we have a law that says everyone has to wear a red hat on Tuesday and Parliament changes its mind and changes it to a blue hat on a Tuesday, then the very passage of the blue hat bill will essentially have within it the implicit repeal of the Tuesday red hat bill. So any law that Parliament passes cannot really break the law because there's that notion of implied repeal, implicit repeal. Now, there is an exception to that, and that is when Parliament says, well, actually, I'm going to pass this law and all of my other future laws have to be consistent with this particular law. And the examples we have of that are the Human Rights Act and European legislation, specifically the 1972 Act. Now, I go on to describe this in a lot more detail in the next presentation, so I don't really want to go into it too much here. But what we're really finding out here is that Parliament has voluntarily put a limit on itself. Parliament has said, for the purposes of this game, for as long as we're playing the Human Rights Act game, all of our future legislation has to be consistent with the Human Rights Act. Or for as long as we're playing the European game, all of our legislation has to be consistent not only with the European Communities Act of 1972, but with the commitments that follow from the European Communities Act of 1972, which is to say that all of our law has to be consistent with European law. Now, has Parliament bound itself? Well, in the short term, yes, because it said that any law that it passes has to be consistent with the Human Rights Act, has to be consistent with the EU. But what we find now, particularly post-Brexit referendum, is that there is genuine scope for both of these laws, both of these baskets of law, if you will, to be repealed. And if these are repealed, then Parliament is free to legislate as it sees fit, which should give a few people cause for some concern. So, judicial review and legal sovereignty. Parliament is the legal sovereign. The courts can't change parliamentary law. They can't strike down parliamentary law the way that they can in the United States. All the courts can do in the UK is to say to Parliament, look, you know how you've passed this law here? For example, you've passed the Job Seekers Back to Work scheme of 2013. You passed that law. Well, you know, we've had a good look at that, and unfortunately, we hate to break this to you, but this is inconsistent with the Human Rights Act that you passed in 1998. And when you passed the Human Rights Act in 1998, you said that everything was going to be consistent with that. And you gave us, that is the courts, the right to call you if you ever passed legislation that was incompatible with the Human Rights Act. So we're not trying to impinge on your sovereignty, not at all. We wouldn't dream of doing that. You're still a legal sovereignty. You're still a legal sovereign. But you asked us to tell you when you broke the law. It's rather like when you're playing rugby, you have to pass the ball backwards. If the referee blows the whistle, it's not because he's infringing on your sovereignty, it's just because you're breaking the rules of the game to which you unilaterally and fairly and with utter free will committed yourself. He's not telling you, oh, you must always pass the ball back. He's just saying, look, you're playing rugby. While you're playing rugby, you have to pass the ball back. Similarly here, the Parliament has taken upon itself an obligation, that is the Human Rights Act, that is the European Community legislation, and as long as it's playing that game, the courts have the right to identify those occasions when Parliament is pulling a fast one, either advertently or inadvertently. And calling Parliament on that is not an infringement of sovereignty. And I'll try to explain that in the next set of presentations. Thanks for now. Hope that makes sense. Speak to you soon. Bye.